Mr. Thompson here. We're looking at U.S. History Standard 5, investigate specific events and key ideas that brought about the adoption and implementation of the U.S. Constitution. More specifically, we're looking at Part B of that standard, evaluate how weaknesses in the Articles of Confederation and Daniel Shays Rebellion led to a call for a stronger central government. The Articles of Confederation were written during the American Revolution and adopted by Congress in 1777. The government structure set up by the Articles reflected Americans' fear of federal power. The way they set it up, the individual states had more power than the national government. Therefore, many conflicts between the states resulted, and this in turn weakened the nation as a whole. And so many influential Americans feared for the future of the nation because they felt the Articles left America very vulnerable from foreign attacks. So many influential Americans said, you know what, we should probably do a constitutional convention because our nation's very existence is at stake if we carry on with these Articles of Confederation. Shays Rebellion in 1787 was an event that really highlighted the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. The particular weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation were the absence of an executive branch, the inability of the federal government to mandate taxes, unregulated commerce or trade, and the lack of a national currency. The federal government that was established by the Articles of Confederation consisted of simply a Congress. So each state had one vote, regardless of the number of delegates representing that state. 9 out of the 13 states had to agree on a law in order for it to be passed. However, there was no executive branch or judicial branch to enforce those laws that Congress passed. Now, this ended up being a major flaw in this government structure set up by the Articles of Confederation. However, they did this to avoid the possibility of monarchical rule because states weren't forced or compelled to behave in a certain way that would have actually made a more productive union. So, under the Articles of Confederation, it was more of a loose grouping of states acting more individually in their own interests, rather than having this system that can come in and say, hey, you must behave this way because it's for the greater good of our group. Articles of Confederation didn't have that power. Taxation had been a contentious issue between England and the colonies. The colonists were used to paying taxes that were levied by their own local assemblies. After the French and Indian War, the British started imposing taxes to pay off debt from that war. But that was met with really big colonial resistance and anger because of a lack of representation in Parliament. So because the colonists said, hey, you can't tax us without having any representation in government or any say. Now, under the Articles of Confederation, citizens paid taxes just to their own state. The most the Confederation government could do to raise revenue, raise money, was to ask the states for donations. There was nothing the federal government could do to enforce the states, so to make them pay. So if states didn't honor the request, they didn't give enough to the federal government, there was nothing the federal government could do to say, hey, you need to comply, because they didn't have that power under the Articles of Confederation. And this was a problem because the states were in debt from the Revolutionary War, and the federal government was very close to complete collapse because of the debt from the Revolutionary War and the inability to get money to raise revenue for the federal government through taxes. They didn't have that power. So this is the complete opposite of, I've got the power. They didn't got the power. I don't got the power. But that doesn't sound as good. So of course, if the federal government's asking for donations for money from the states, but the states are in debt, they don't got any money to give, to donate, and the federal government doesn't, so nobody had money. During the early years after the Revolutionary War, the states were really acting independently of one another and a lot of times in direct competition with each other. Now, the federal government under the Articles of Confederation didn't have the power to establish a national currency or to regulate commerce, so regulate trade. And so these two issues, this lack of national currency and not being able to regulate trade, hindered the development of the United States because the states were just acting in their own interest independently rather than prospering economically as a whole one unit nation. All of these weaknesses were negatively impacting the nation. However, it would be pretty difficult to make changes to this government structure set up by the Articles of Confederation because a unanimous agreement must be made to make any amendments to the Articles of Confederation. So they needed all 13 states to agree to make a policy change within the Articles of Confederation. Now, this was going to be difficult because the states were acting much more individually, so in their own interests, rather than a true confederation. However, after a few years, it kept becoming increasingly apparent with all these negative impacts from the flaws in the Articles of Confederation that if the United States was going to last, some changes must be made. Shays Rebellion ended up being the event that motivated political leaders to say, okay, we really need to make these changes in this Articles of Confederation because Shays Rebellion, they felt, set a dangerous precedent for mob rule. Daniel Shays led more than 1,000 farmers who, just like him, were debt-ridden and hurting during this state's poor economy that was stemming from the Revolutionary War debt. Shays led and tried to seize this federal arsenal in Massachusetts, but was turned back by the Massachusetts militia. Now, this was just one of many protests during this time period of debt-ridden farmers. But Shays Rebellion highlighted the weak government and its inability to mandate taxes, not being able to help repair the national economy. The weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, emphasized by the events surrounding Shays Rebellion, led prominent figures like George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison to call for a convention in Philadelphia to get together to try to solve these issues. In May 1787, George Washington was elected president of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, where he and the founding fathers created a new federalist form of government for the United States. The earlier fears of concentrating too much power into one individual or one central government had given way to the growing vulnerability of the United States that was happening under the Articles of Confederation. So the big question now, the big issue was how to get 13 different states with varying demographics and different goals to agree on a new federalist form of government that was shifting more power to the federal government.